So tonight, we have John Muir, who will be doing a chautauqua for us. What is a chautauqua? Chautauquans are scholars who portray historical characters. Tonight we have John Muir, who will represent an environmental perspective in the West and will help bring to life the ideas that began during the 19th century in response to the wide-scale destruction of public lands by some of the early pioneers. The character of John Muir will make a 40-minute presentation and will then take questions from the audience as the character and then take questions as a scholar of John Muir. John Muir has been referred to as a naturalist, explorer, inventor, and philosopher. A Scottish immigrant, John spent much of his adult life exploring and studying the Sierras and Alaska. The author of more than 24 books, John gained respect as the nation's foremost spokesperson for wilderness and the ideas of preservation and reverence for life. He promoted the designation of Yosemite, Grand Canyon, and Petrified Forest National Parks, and was one of the founders and first president of the Sierra Club in 1892. Please welcome John.
Greetings, friends and fellow lovers of nature. It is truly an honor to come here today, for I understand that we have many bird lovers here. In fact, is this the Audubon Society of Prescott? Well, I must say it's an honor to be invited here, and I just appreciate that there's people in this fine town who are caring about nature, for the landscape around Prescott is quite amazing. And I know it is something that has drawn you here, and I hope you will appreciate some of the stories that I have to share with you tonight about my experiences out in nature. And I'd also like to say that this is an amazing place, this Natural History Institute. And so you're very fortunate in this town to have people who really care. I've just come from a glorious saunter in the forest not far from here, when I came across one of God's greatest creatures, a mountain lion. I had just gone out into the forest. Have you smelled the ponderosas after a fresh snowfall? It is really quite remarkable. And there I was in the forest, and I came across a small freshet flowing down through the trees. And I knelt down to get some water, and there I saw the fresh track of a mountain lion. And I took a sip of water, and then I looked up, and there he was, not 60 yards away. And I said, "Hello, Mr. Mountain Lion." Well, I think he was rather surprised with my enthusiasm, and he ran over to a tree and climbed up into this ponderosa. And then I came beneath him, and I looked up at him, and then I realized, this is a very foolish place for me to be standing. And so I moved over to another ponderosa, and I ascended into that tree, and there we gazed at each other for a good 40 minutes. Well, I think I had never seen a mountain lion. I'd always wanted to see it. And there I could see his tongue panting, his pink tongue, and his whiskers vibrating. And do you know what color a mountain lion's eyes are? Well, these were emerald green, although I've heard that there are yellow ones as well. Well, we gazed at each other for a good while, and I felt he was looking into my soul, and perhaps I was looking at his. And then after about 40 minutes, I think he grew rather bored with me. He stood up on the branch, he stretched and yawned, and from 25 feet off the ground, he leapt, and with bark flying in all directions, where he touched the trunk once and landed like a whisper and disappeared into the forest. And I sat there for a while thinking, thanking God for this glorious experience, for I've always had wanted to see a mountain lion, and I got an up-close experience. Well, after about 40 minutes, though, he did jump off the tree and disappear into the forest, and so I was just such a happy person on this day. And then I went walking through the forest, and I came across a road. And I began walking down the road when I heard in the distance the cutting of wood. And as I approached, I could see that there were several trees that had been felled along the road. And then I came around a bend, and there were two men in uniforms, and they had just finished cutting down a huge alligator juniper. And I went up to them, I said, "What are you doing to my trees?" And they looked at me like I was daft. And I said, "What are you doing to the trees?" And they said, "Well, we've been given orders by the government to cut down these trees to daylight the road." "What is daylighting the road?" I asked. "We've been given directions to cut down these trees to daylight the road so that after rain the roads will dry out faster." And then they went on their way. I knelt down and I counted the rings, for every ring represents another year's growth. 1,200 years. 1,200 years this tree had lived in our forest. And these men, representing our government, had just cut it down to daylight the road. Why, that's about as ridiculous as when they cut down one of my sequoias in California to make a dance floor for 50 people. Or another, they skinned it to a height of 150 feet to send off to the monarchs of Europe to show the mighty strength of our forests. We might as well skin our politicians and send them abroad to show the strength of our government. But I did not come here today to share with you these terrible things I've seen, but rather share with you how nature has really affected my life. When I was growing up in Scotland, it was nature that was my escape from the drudgeries of school. For you see, in Scotland in those days, they believed that you should memorize your lessons. And if you did not have your lessons memorized by heart, you were soundly thrashed. For you see, in Scotland in those days, they believed that there was a clear connection between the excitement of the flesh and the retention of the mind. Oh. And at home it was much the same, for you see, my father was a devout Calvinist and believed that we should memorize the Bible. So by the age of 11, I had the entire New Testament and 2/3 of the Old Testament memorized by heart. And Father would often beat me on a daily basis, saying, "John, I know you've likely sinned today." Well, I was a boy growing up in Scotland, and after the school, we would go down to the ruins of the Dunbar Castle, and we would fight against the English. And I'd come home bloodied. But we put a good test on the English for sure. And then my father said, "What have you been up to? No good, I see. You've got blood all over your face and clothes. Bend over." And I was thrashed again. Oh, they were brutal beatings. But one day I came home from school and my father said, "John, tonight you do not have to memorize your lessons for school or the Bible. Pack your things for tomorrow. I'm taking you, your older brother, and your sister, and we are going to America." America? I had read about America, where it was said that a squirrel could climb up in a tree and go from tree limb to tree limb from the Atlantic all the way to a mighty river called the Mississippi without ever touching the ground. And that maple trees grew out of gold and their sap tasted like sugar. And we were going to a wilderness called Wisconsin. Now, are any of you from Wisconsin? No. Oh, you are? Where are you from? Watertown. Watertown. Well, is that anywhere near that place called Milwaukee? It is. Well, it took us 2 months to get to this place called Milwaukee. Now, it wasn't much of a place. It was muddy roads and wooden buildings, and a lot of the people smelled really bad. Is it still the same? Okay, well, we should talk. So, my goodness, yeah. So you're from Wisconsin. That's wonderful. Well, my father bought a wagon, and we put all of our stuff in the wagon, and there was no room for my brother and sister and I, so we had to walk behind the wagon for 3 weeks out into the wilderness of Wisconsin. And all I wanted to do was have time to go explore and discover all the new animals and trees and plants. But when we arrived at a place about 7 miles from Portage, do you know where Portage is? You do? Well, talk. She knows where Portage is. Well, we made our farm there, and Father had us up at 4 o'clock in the morning. We had to cut down trees and pull out the stumps and plow the field and build a cabin so that after 3 months, my younger brothers and sisters and my mother could come and there'd be a shelter for us for those cold Wisconsin winters. Well, we were there for a good 7 years. And Father had us working for 5, 6, 7 days a week. Well, on the 7th day, of course, we did not work. We always read the Bible. But it was there, too, that my father had this divine inspiration that he should put his family on a diet of graham crackers and water for 3 months to purify our souls. And another time, I came down with the pneumonia. And he said, John, you've been sinning a lot lately. The work will do you good. Oh. But one day I asked my father, if I get up early in the morning, can I have some time to myself? He said, yes. I woke up the next morning at 1 o'clock. I had 3 hours, and I went down into our cellar, and there I lit a candle, and I was able to read books that my father had not allowed into the house. That neighbors had said, John, have you read this book on botany? Or have you read this book on history or philosophy? Well, I brought them in and I read them. And I was amazed by some of these ideas. And I also had time to work on inventions. Well, I made a thermometer that could measure the change in temperature when a man walked within 3 feet of it, and a barometer, and a clock that we put up in the bur oak tree with side that would show the time of day from across the fields so we know when our 15 hours of work were done. But I think one of my favorite machines, well, I called it an early rising machine. And this was a clock attached to weights that was attached to my bed. And at the given hour, it would lift up my bed, deposit me on the floor, push out a book, light a candle, and begin turning pages in 1-minute intervals. And after 15 minutes, it would close the book and set out another. Now that, I figured, was good Scottish efficiency. And my father did not think so. And he nearly broke them up and said, John, you would better spend your time reading the Bible. Oh, I had the Bible nearly memorized. Well, one of the neighbors came by, though, and said, John, your inventions are really quite amazing. Have you thought about taking them to the state fair in Madison? But I was 23 years old, and I'd not left home. And so I asked my father, can I have my brother take me in the wagon to the train? And I packed up some of my inventions, and he took me to the train, and there the conductor came up and said, what do we have here, young man? And I said, well, I'm an inventor, and I'm going to the state fair in Madison, Wisconsin. An inventor, he said. Well, perhaps you'd like to come up and meet the engineer. Well, I'd never been on a train before. And he went up to the engineer, and he whispered in his ear, he said, I think there's a man out here who's a Scottish immigrant, but he's interested in all the gadgets. And he said, would you like to come up into the engine? And he began explaining all these knobs and dials and gadgets. And then he said, would you like to sit up here while we go on our train? And I said, yes. And soon we were flying across the countryside. It was so beautiful. And then he asked the most amazing question. He said, have you ever ridden on the cowcatcher? I said, no. He said, well, you seem like an agile young man. All you have to do is hang on and crawl out and go along the front of the train, and when you get to the cow catcher, hold on. I got there. I felt as though I were flying. Oh my goodness, you should try it sometime. Well, we arrived after several hours in Madison, and there I asked, what's the way to the fairgrounds? And they said, well, it's up on the knoll. And there I set up some of my inventions, and I saw these two boys walking by, and I said, would you mind being my assistants? And soon I had them being deposited in the ground in 15-minute intervals. And my booth was written up in the paper. Have you seen the amazing inventions by the young Scottish immigrant, John Muir? But what was incredible was that one of the boys was the son of Dr. and Mrs. Carr, professor of geology at the University of Wisconsin. And he invited me home for dinner, and after dinner he escorted me into the parlor where we drank tea out of china. Oh, so this is how people live in the big city. And he began to ask me questions. And he said, you seem like a very intelligent young man. Have you thought about attending the university? Oh, I said, I only had 6th grade in school in Scotland. And where I lived out in the country, there was no school. And he said, yes, well, we'll give you some tests and see how you do. Well, I did quite well. And I was asked and invited to become a student at the University of Wisconsin, where I was able to study subjects like geology and botany and chemistry. And it was there that I also was introduced by Mrs. Carr to the transcendental writers, Ralph Waldo Emerson, Henry David Thoreau, and how my heart filled with joy, for I realized there were kindred spirits that believed as I did, that if you worship God, go out into nature, for that is his creation. And it made me wonder, this is where I want to spend my time, except that after 3 years, the Civil War broke out. Now, we were pacifists, so we did not believe in killing. And my mother pleaded with my brother and I to leave and go to Ontario, Canada, because she said, you are not raised to kill. And so we left, and I left the University of Wisconsin and entered the University of the Wilderness. My brother found work at a carriage factory on the north shore of Lake Huron, but I gave myself 3 months to explore the primordial forests of Ontario. Have any of you been to Ontario? These were forests that extended for hundreds of miles, trees that were hundreds of years old. But it was there on a cold November morning that I was given my first lesson in nature. I came to a great marsh. It extended for miles in both directions, but there I could see the distant shore. It looked like a couple of miles across, and I stepped into the marsh, and soon I was up to my hips and then my chest. But I made my way halfway across the marsh when I came to a small island. And I crawled out, for I was quite cold by then. But there was the Calypso borealis, the rare white orchid of the north. And I realized the universe would be incomplete without man, but it would be incomplete without the smallest transmicroscopic creature that dwells beyond our conceitful eyes and knowledge. In nature, this truth is apparent, and man can see himself a part of something more profound. Well, I spent time and finally made it to where my brother was working at the carriage factory. And we were able to save up some money and send it to my family in Wisconsin. But a few months after we got there, there was a fire, and it burned the entire factory down. So I had to look elsewhere, and by then the Civil War had come to an end. And I heard that there were jobs in a place called Indianapolis. Now, is anybody here from Indianapolis? No. Well, I arrived there, and I found work at a carriage factory. And so I got there, and I began exploring and discovering the machinery that they had. And I could see that the men were not working in any good Scottish order. So I gave them suggestions and said, you know, in Scotland, this is... Oh, they didn't appreciate that. But I was there one morning before any of the other men arrived, and I was tightening up one of the belts when suddenly the file slipped and plunged into my right eye. I could feel the aqueous humor dripping into my palm. And the men found me crumpled up in the corner when they arrived at work, and they took me home, and a doctor was summoned. He examined me and he said, John, you've severely injured your right eye. I do not know if you'll ever see out of it again. There is a chance, but you must remain in a darkened room with the bandages on your face for both eyes for 2 months. Oh. I felt as though I'd been laid in a casket. I prayed to God. I prayed, if ever I had the chance to see again, I would forever forget the inventions of man and go out and worship the inventions of God in nature. And after 2 months, they raised the blinds, and I saw the light of day through both of my eyes. I could see. I kept my promise. And I began a 1,000-mile walk through the South 2 years after the Civil War. The amount of suffering and the ruination of an entire landscape laid before me. But I found places up in the mountains of Appalachia, glens and glades that had not been touched by the war, and God's truth and beauty came through. I eventually made my way to a place called Savannah. My intent was to go to South America, for I had read the great works of Alexander von Humboldt. And my intent was to go explore the Amazon to its source. But when I arrived in Savannah, I found the only place that I felt was safe to sleep was the cemetery. And during the night, it must have been there that I was severely bitten by mosquitoes, one that carried the malaria. Oh. Well, I made my way to Florida, and somehow I made across the peninsula to the Gulf Coast. And there, a doctor treated me with quinine. And he said, you are in terrible shape, John Muir. What is this delirious talk you keep saying about going to the Amazon? That would be foolish. And he recommended that I go to a place called California. Well, I had saved enough money and kept it in my shoes so that nobody could steal it, that I was able to buy a ticket on a great white sailing ship that made its way down to the Panama, and there I crossed the isthmus, and took another 3 weeks for us to get up to a place called San Francisco, where I jumped off the boat and I yelled out, what is the fastest way to the wilderness? Oh, people just shook their head. But there was one young man that said, I'll go with you, Johnny Muir. And so we went out into the Central Valley of California in the springtime. Have you been there in the springtime? It was a carpet of flowers for 500 miles from north to south. And there in the distance was the Sierras, the range of light, covered with snow. And we made our way to a place that was called Yosemite. And it had been made into a state park. And I found work at a lumber mill, for there had been a great windstorm and many of the big trees had fallen over. And I also built a little cabin, and that's where I had a little trap door that went right down into the creek, and I was able to get fresh glacier water. It's the best. But it was there too that I had time to go up into the mountains with sheep, for they needed a sheep herder, and I had plenty of time herding sheep in Scotland. But it gave me time to read books and to write in a journal. And I wrote stories about the water ouzel. What a wonderful bird. It can walk underwater, and it makes its nest under a waterfall. And I also kept journals and read a book by Whitney, Dr. Whitney, the state geologist, where he believed that Yosemite Valley was caused by a great catalysmic event, where an earthquake caused the valley floor to drop 5,000 feet. Well, I was there during a big earthquake where Eagle Rock even fell off. But I did not see the floor drop out even an inch. And so I wrote this in my journal, and I sent my journal to Mrs. Carr, for she had come with her husband, who had gotten a professorship at the University of California, Berkeley. And unbeknownst to me, Mrs. Carr sent my essays to Dr. Whitney. Oh. I got a letter back from him. Who is John Muir? What does he know about geology or anything for that matter? Oh, I was so embarrassed. But she also sent my essay to Dr. Agassiz, the great alpine geologist of Switzerland, where I described that I saw in the rocks concentric gouges and grooves. And up in the highest of the mountains, I found the remnants of glaciers. And 2 months later, I received a letter from Dr. Agassiz, and he said, to the geologist John Muir, I do believe you've come across concrete evidence of glaciation. I am sending my colleagues in geology to Yosemite. Please attend to their needs. Oh, Mrs. Carr, this is really getting out of hand. But what I didn't know, too, is that she also sent some of my essays to Centennial magazine, and were published. And soon there were people coming to Yosemite Valley to ask to see the great young transcendental writer, John Muir, the tramp. But one of the most incredible days of my life was when Ralph Waldo Emerson came to the valley and asked to meet the young transcendental writer, John Muir. Oh, he was with several important-looking men, and I said, would you like to camp out amongst the great trees? And they said, oh, John, that would be very rude. You know, he's staying in the hotel. Oh, well, the hotel is damp and cold. He'd be better out. And I didn't say that. But we spent time together. He even invited me to come back to a place called Concord, Massachusetts, and stay at his house and study the ideas of the transcendentalists. But I said, how can I leave this place? These are my trees, my animals. This is my home. And so, after 5 days, they got up on their horses, and he got up on a great, beautiful white horse. And they began crossing the meadow. And from a distance he called back, John, remember this. The wonder is that we can see these trees and not wonder more. And so I find the vast majority of humanity is oblivious to the beauties and wonders of nature. Any fool can destroy a tree. They cannot run away. And if they could, they would be still chased and hunted as long as fun or a dollar could be got out of their bark, their hide, their spreading horn branches, their magnificent bold backbones. And few who fell trees plant them. Nor would planting avail anything like the noble forest that once graced our continent. In a man's lifetime, only saplings can be grown, compared to trees centuries old. It took 3,000 years to grow some of our trees in western woods, trees that are still standing in perfect strength and beauty. Since all the eventful centuries since Christ's time, and long before that, God has cared for these trees, saved them from drought, disease, avalanche, and 1,000 strange tempests and floods. But he cannot save them from fools. It is only people who care that can do that. And so I ask you, care for the trees, care for the animals. They need us. Thank you. Well, you've been very kind, and I do have to go soon, but I would be happy to answer a few questions if you have them. Yes?
From what I understand, he walked barefoot.
Well, I did to some extent, yes. Not the whole time, but I did. Yes, I think if you build up calluses, you can walk in a lot of places. I didn't walk barefoot when I went up Mount Shasta, though, you know. Yes, I did. And have you been to Alaska? Mm-hmm. Well, can I tell a story about a dog that I had an experience with in Alaska? Well, I was up there with a group of men, and I went there, I think 7 times, actually. And this one time I was up there, and I went to visit a friend of mine, Hal Young, who was a Presbyterian minister who was working with the Stikine tribe. He had been given a dog by a French fur trapper. Now, I could tell you many a dog and many a dog stories, for growing up in Scotland, I tended sheep, and we had amazing dogs that would whistle, that you could whistle to, and they knew exactly what they were supposed to do. This was not that kind of dog. He didn't look very intelligent. He had a long snout and wispy hair and a shaggy tail, and when the wind blew in the wrong direction, he looked all disheveled. And when we'd go in to stop and explore a place, he would be off, and he would never come when you called him. And we were at this one place where we had gotten and stopped on a beach and had gone exploring a while, and he did not come back. And Hall called him and called him. And I thought, well, perhaps he's been eaten by a wolf. Oops. But as we took the boats out and were about 100 feet out from the shore, there he comes. And he jumps into the water and swims out to the boat, and they pulled him out, and of course he shook all over us and got us all wet. Well, that night we camped by a great glacier. And in the middle of the night, I could hear the wind. And I thought to myself, this is no time for me to be hiding in a tent. I must be out and see what is about on the glacier. And so I was making my getaway when all of a sudden I heard this pathetic little, Oh, Stikine, go back. Go back. Go back to your master where you belong. You are not going to go out on the glacier with me. That would not be good. And then I turned and I started to go, and then I heard this, and he came up and he raised his little paw. And what was I to do? I reached in my pocket and I pulled out some crumbs of bread and I said, here's your breakfast, let's be off. And so began one of the most eventful days of my life. We made it out on the glacier, and there was a moon, so we could see quite well. And we came across crevasses that were 3, 4, 5 feet across. And we made it a game of jumping across these crevasses until we came to one that was 7 feet across, and 8 and 9, and one was 10. And it made it across, and so did Stikine. And then we made it to another one that was 12 feet across and lower on the other side. And I jumped with only an inch to spare, and Stikeen made it as well. And so we went running on, thinking this was a wonderful day, until we came to a glacier crevasse that was 50 feet across. And I ran to the right for a good quarter mile, and there my heart sunk, for the two crevasses came together. And I ran back to the left for another half mile, my heart sinking, oh, I've done such a stupid thing. And I looked, and there, sure enough, the crevasses came together there. And I realized we were stranded on an island of ice in a deepening storm. And my beard was already frozen, and I did not have warm enough clothes. And so I began searching desperately for a way out. I could not go back, for it was too high on the far side. And finally, I found one place where an ice bridge had melted and dipped down 25 feet and made it all the way across to the other side. So I took out my ice axe, and I began carving steps into the ice down 25 feet. And I made it to the bridge, and there I shivved off the top and scooched across all the 50 feet to the other side. And there I made steps up to the top. But think of Stikeen. When I began making the steps, he came up and put his head on my shoulder, and as if in proper British said, "No, no!" And then he ran off. And the poor dog. And so I called to him, and I said, "John," or I said, "Please, you must come now. For I hear their wolves are calling, and they heard your pathetic crying, and they will eat you for sure if you go back the other way. And so please, you must come now. All I can say is, I can't stay here or I will die. And all I can say is, if you don't come, I'll come back and try to get you in the morning. So now you must come." As if he understood every word I said, he looked forward to the edge, and his front paws came up to the very edge and went down to the first step. And his back paws came over and down to the first step and down to the next and the next and the next. And then he made it to the bridge, but it was here that I feared he would not make it across, for the wind was just blowing in both directions. And he made it out to the middle of the bridge and realized if every step had to count or otherwise he would die. And he made it to the other side. But then I worried the most, for dogs are not good climbers on vertical ice. And as I was trying to think, I had no rope and I had my belt and it wouldn't reach. And out of the corner of my eye, I saw that he was running towards the cliff. And he came to the first one, and up, 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 and he made it to the top. And then he ran past me and came back, and from 10 feet away, he leapt and hit me in the face, and we rolled and laughed and screamed. We were safe. And I realized when Moses made it to the sea and God separated it for them to get back to the Zion, he did not have this much joy. And so through Stikeen, I've seen with greater clarity, as if through a window of clear glass, our connection to other animals. For it is said that animals do not have emotions. Well, this dog, I experienced the joy of the game, and then the terror of the crevasse, and then the absolute joy of the salvation. And after that, when we made camp, Stikeen would come up while we were around the campfire and lay his head on my lap and look up to me with his big brown eyes as if to say, "Now that was quite an adventure." Thank you. Yes.
So when you're out in the woods, did you learn to eat the native foods of the forest?
Mm.
What did you eat?
Well, yes. Do you know that you can make tea out of pine needles? It's quite good. It's kind of tastes a little bit like buttery sap. I also was very good at berries, and you know, I only killed an animal once, and it was when I was walking to the Sierras with this friend from the boat, and we had our guns, and we came across a rattlesnake, and I shot it, and I realized the snake did not mean me any harm. It was obvious that I was afraid of him and he just wanted to get away. And so that's the only animal that I ever was faced, and I never carried a gun again. Well, you've been very nice, and so I just appreciate that you've had the opportunity to come and hear some of my stories. And I'd be happy to now maybe be around for if you want to talk some more. Okay.
Thank you, John. Now I'm going to introduce Doug. Doug Hulmes has performed John Muir for several years under a contract with the Arizona Humanities Council on a Scholar Speakers Bureau. He is a professor emeritus of environmental studies at Prescott College, where he taught courses in ecology, environmental education, and environmental history and philosophy. Doug received an award for Outstanding Presenter at the National Wilderness Rangers Conference in Durango, Colorado, for his performance of John Muir. In September of 2004, Doug was invited to perform in Washington, D.C. for the 40th anniversary celebration of the Wilderness Act. In 2009, Doug performed for the opening of an international conference on friluftsliv. I don't know if that's really pronounced.
Very good.
At Nord-Trøndelag University in Norway. He is presently researching the traditions, mythology, and folklore of planting sacred trees on farms in Norway and Sweden. You can Google his paper, The Sacred Trees of Norway and Sweden, if you're interested in his research on the folklore and traditions related to the trees in Scandinavia. Sounds really interesting. So if you have any questions for Doug now.
Thank you. You've been a really kind audience, and it's so nice to see so many of my friends here too. So I really appreciate this opportunity to share of a person that really had a big impact on me in my life. And so if you have any questions about John Muir or my work, please. Yes? Oh, yeah.
How long did John Muir live, and how old was he when he passed away, and where did he die?
Wow, okay. He was born in 1838, and he died in 1914 in Los Angeles. He had pneumonia, and he died on Christmas Eve. And it was sad because it was right after the government had made the decision to build the Hetch Hetchy Dam, which he had fought for several years. And so that was in Yosemite Park, Yosemite National Park, and it was the first test of our country for people to decide, should we use our national parks just for people and for whatever, development or whatever, or should we use it to protect the environments and the animals that live there? I worked for the Park Service in Canyonlands, so I really appreciate the difference between our national parks, which I think are intended for people to use, but also to protect the environments for the animals that depend on them, as compared to the Forest Service, which is a multiple use philosophy. And I think we need both, and we need to care for both our forests and our parks. And so, yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
How did the trees in Norway come to be called sacred trees?
Well, that's a very good question, because I taught there. I was a guest professor at Telemark College for a year, and I taught in Norway's first interdisciplinary environmental studies program for international students. And so during that year, we spent a section on the coast and a section up in the mountains and a section in Oslo. And when we were up in the mountains, we had the opportunity to learn how to render beaver to make beverkjøtt i brunsaus, which is beaver meatballs in brown gravy, or learn to shear a sheep and spin the wool and learn to knit, and we all chose that. And so I have to say that I wouldn't recommend Beverschuppelie Brunnen sauce. It actually gave me cramps. But the trees in Norway are very similar to the trees here, but what I found, which was pretty incredible, was that they have this tradition of planting a tree in the courtyard of the farm called a tuntre in Norwegian, and in Swedish it's called a vårdträd, which means a caring or guardian tree. And so the trees originally, before they became Christian, were planted on the grave of the original farmer, and it was believed that your ancestral spirits would reside in the tree, and the care of the tree ensured the health of the farm, and the health of the farm is reflected in the health of the tree. And so when I was at Telemark, I got to go out with a colleague from the university who studied the cultural landscape of the farms in Norway, and especially the husmannsplass, which are really the poorest of the farmers who were given some property to work on the big farm. And so the little husmannsplatz are typical crofters, I guess you would call it in English. And a lot of those were the ones that came to America because they couldn't get property themselves to own. It was the Norwegian tradition that the oldest boy would inherit the property. Well, if you had 12 kids in the family, that didn't leave anything for the rest of them. So are any of you of Scandinavian descent? Okay, so it's a big part of our background. And I have to say, for me, I was fortunate that my grandparents told me the folklore when I was growing up of the Tumta, which are the equivalent of the Norwegian Nisse, which are the little elves or intermediaries between humans and nature. And so I grew up hearing about the Tumta on the farm and how you had to really be nice to the animals and be responsible and take care of things. Otherwise, the Tumta would do nasty things to you. And I've got a ceramic Tumta in my house that's been in my family for 5 generations. And when you look at him, you go, I'm not going to do anything bad. He's not a really nice-looking Tumta. But in Norwegian, they're called Nisse. And another tradition that I came across was called the livstred tradition, which is planting a fruit tree for the birth of a child. And the amazing thing is I taught a course at Prescott College on rafting and environmental perspectives, where we would float down and I would do the geology and natural history of Desolation and Gray on the Green River and then Cataract Canyon. And so we were going down Desolation and Gray and got to the Rock Creek Ranch, and there was a new book that came out on the history of the Desolation and Gray wilderness. And it said that 3 brothers that built the ranch house in the late 1800s at the Rock Creek Ranch were from Skåne, Sweden. I thought, well, that's right next to where my grandfather came from, and they were stonecutters like my grandfather was. And so the ranch house was beautiful. It was amazing stone-cut a ranch house, but it burned down probably in the 1930s or 40s, and so it was remnants, but it was still there. And turned out that their sister came and she married Jim McPherson on the McPherson Ranch 10 miles down the river on the other side, so on the Ute Reservation now. And I thought, well, I wonder if it's said in the book that this woman from Sweden had planted a fruit tree for each of her 4 children. And I thought, I've been to the McPherson Ranch and I haven't seen a tree, but I went down there and went back behind where the ranch ruins are, and there was a spring, and next to the spring was a 100-year-old apricot and a pear. So it's in one of the most remote places in the lower 48, and I found a tradition that comes from my ancestors in Sweden. So, any other questions? Yeah.
What about the relationship between Muir and Teddy Roosevelt? You said that John Muir never carried a gun, and Teddy Roosevelt was quite the trophy hunter. What was that? Do you know much about that relationship?
Well, I happen to, yeah. Thanks, Paul. Yeah, actually, last year I got to do a program with New Mexico Humanities Council with Teddy Roosevelt and Alda Leopold. And I don't know if you remember Al Carr, any of you? And then Steve Morgan. started, after Al passed away, Steve Morgan picked up and started doing Aldo Leopold. Aldo Leopold, and this is a really interesting perspective too, is that he was a Forest Service employee back in the 1920s, but he went on to advocate for the designation of the Gila Wilderness, which was an administratively designated wilderness in the 1920s and became the model for the Wilderness Act. But he also shot one of the last Mexican wolves in Arizona, and it's in his book, Sand Colony Almanac, where he watched the green fire die. And it's a classic essay about killing one of the last wolves in Arizona, and that later in life he realized that the wolves are important for maintaining the balance of nature, and that there were big problems when all the predators were shot off. And so I had the opportunity of working with Don Hoffman, who was the Forest Service ranger who was working with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service on the Alpine District of the Apache Sitgraves for reintroduction of the red wolves, and or the Mexican wolves rather. And we were there for a meeting, and he said, I want to take you out to a place on the Black River where I think this is where Aldo Leopold shot one of the wolves. And so we got out there, and he said, you know, I got actually a letter from Aldo Leopold's daughter, Nina Leopold Bradley, who I got to meet at the Ranger Conference in Colorado. And she said that the parents had died, and out of the safety deposit box, they found a letter that Aldo had written to his mother after he had shot the wolf and described where it was. And so they're pretty certain that it's on the Black River. And so we were there, and Don honored me by saying, Doug, would you read the essay of Watching the Green Fire Die, which is a really powerful essay of this female wolf that was out there with their guns and shot him, and shot the wolf and you know, a couple of the pups and stuff. And it was really a terrible description, but realizing that he changed greatly, and by the time he had finished being a professor at the University of Wisconsin, and created a place called the Shack, where he did a restoration project above on the Wisconsin River, in a little place where he bought a chicken coop on a place where the farmhouse had burned down, and did a restoration of that property, and now it's still an institute up there on restoration. But yeah, Aldo Leopold, I think, to me represents something that we all need to remember, because I actually had a student come into my class probably 2019 or so, and say, why are we studying John Muir? You know, he's a racist. And I went, well, what is your reason for saying that? Well, he described the people at Yosemite, the indigenous people, as being desperate, alcoholic, deprived people. And I said, when did you get that quote? Well, it was in the LA Times. And I said, well, when did this happen in California? And they didn't know. And I said, well, he came to Yosemite 40 years after the federal government had literally been doing cultural genocide of Native Americans in California, when they wanted to basically get rid of them so they could mine the gold and take the money out of the California. And I said, you know, how would you describe people who survived the Holocaust? And that's what he was doing. He was describing the desperate people who were remnants 40 years after there had been a cultural genocide of the tribe that had been at Yosemite. And yes, we do have problems with our Parks and Forest Service and public lands when we realize that those lands were the homes of indigenous peoples before that. But we've got an incredible example that's going on now up in the Bears Ears up in Utah, that is being now managed by the government in cooperation with the indigenous peoples from around there. Unfortunately, our president cut 80% of that out and wanted to turn it into real estate, but it was put back by Biden, and I'm not sure what the status is now. Do any of you know? Tom, have you heard anything recently?
It's still in flux.
So it's really unfortunate, because we're finally getting to the point where we recognize that indigenous people deserve to have a say at the table, especially about a lot of these places that were their homes. So I want you to know that John Muir did refer to the people as desperate, but he also referred to, and this is what they said, well, he referred to the blacks in the South as Sambos. And I said, well, I remember growing up in Illinois and we had Sambo's restaurants. So we can't condemn people from where they're at, but maybe we can help them understand how we all need to change to consider the rights not only of other people and minorities and people with disabilities or whatever, but the animals. And John Muir was really one of the first to recognize the intrinsic right and that animals have personalities. It wasn't until Jane Goodall really recognized that our Western science has been really wrong in saying that animals don't have emotions. Go figure. Anybody who has a dog knows that. And so I thank Stakeen for helping me with that. Thank you very much. And I really appreciate the Audubon Society and all of you. Thank you.